this great affection for something so much that that thing starts to consume you. And I feel, in my opinion, I would say like a cult can be idolatry and brainwashing. Now, I know some people might think that like a religion or certain religions, probably like Christianity, might be a cult, but I would like to say that they're different, just for the simple fact that a cult is something that will accept you regardless. So all you have to do is follow their rituals. Everyone's welcomed, everyone's accepted. There's really no restrictions on who can join. But in Christianity, or like with having faith in God, the Bible tells us to pay attention to certain things and to make sure that we're following in the right way, in the way of the Lord, just God, the Father, and making sure that our life is emulating like what it is to be a Christian. And so not everyone is going to be accepted into that, because some people are deceived and they can think that they're doing something in the right way or in the way of God or in the way of the Lord, and they're really not. The Bible tells us in Matthew chapter 7 verse 21, that everyone who says they're a believer, everyone who says, they follow the way of the Lord, they're not going to enter into the kingdom of heaven. They're not going to be saved. Why? Because they weren't actually doing those things for God, or they weren't actually doing all those things in the will of God. They were just doing it for themselves. And that's another important thing to notice when you hear the word cult. A lot of it is like you're doing it so you're worshiping one person, or you might be worshiping yourself. You're doing it in your flesh, and it might be of the world. It's carnal things. But the Bible warns us to make sure that we have our minds separated from the things of this world, because we can get so caught up in carnal things, we can get so caught up in the world, in our flesh, that we don't realize that although God created us to be logistic and logical beings, He created us, He gave us a brain. Our brain functions using like brain cells and sending signals to other parts of our body to tell us to do whatever, whether it be to walk, to wake up, to speak, like how I'm speaking to you right now. And we wouldn't be able to do certain things without nerves running through our bodies. And we are logistic beings. However, we are also spiritual beings, and we shouldn't get too caught up in just being carnal minded, because we are in this world, but we're not of this world. And I hope, I know that it can sound confusing to some people, and I hope that I really pray that you try to get the understanding of it and look at these verses. So Matthew 7 verse 21, and then I think another one is this one right here. It basically tells us how, let's see if I can, it tells us how we are not supposed to allow our sinful nature to get in the way of being committed to God. And our sinful nature, which is our carnal mind, the things that we think about, is what stops us from obeying God's laws. It's what stops us from being in God's will and really submitted to Him, and not doing things just like everything that He tells us to do, but also doing what we want as human beings or as people in our everyday lives. And it's important to remember and realize that doing the things that we want will lead us to a sure death. The Bible tells us that. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this is because I overheard a conversation about how the conversation was talking about a certain religion. I won't go into what the specific religion was, but it wasn't Christianity. And basically, in most religions, it's always started by a group leader or a man, or just a person who starts the religion and tries to get everyone else to follow that religion. And in that way, it can be very much like a cult, because it can be training each individual to do a certain thing or to commit to certain rituals and certain practices that, that don't really align with the Bible. And one thing is, like, to distinguish between like what it says in the Bible and just like other religions, is that in the Bible, it tells us how God gives us free will. He will never force himself up on anybody. The God is three entities in one: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And he actually is a gentleman, because he doesn't force himself on you. He gives you the free will to, whether you want to live with him, you want to come into a relationship with him, and you want to really get to know God. That is your choice. It's not forced upon you. And the other thing is, like, he just gives us free will. He gives us free will, and then he gives us grace. So then if we don't completely, submit ourselves in his will, we don't know how to be good Christians when we first start off in our Christian walk. Then God gives us grace, and we're still covered by his grace. We're covered by his blood when his son died for us, which is Jesus Christ, and gave up his life for us. We are under that blood covenant. We are under a dispensation of grace and mercy, and God has mercy on us. So it's not like where if you were to be in a cult, they might get rid of you, or they might try to harm you and bring harm to you and your family for not committing to all those rituals, or for messing up, or for not doing exactly what they tell you to do in that moment. And so that's like a really distinguishing fact for you to know, that God gives us free will, and he will never ever force himself on you. Even when you mess up, God still loves you. Jesus Christ still loves you, and he gives you more free will. He gives you more grace to always turn your life over and completely submit and change and start to walk in the way that he would want you to walk, which is as making your life similar to Christ. And although we won't be perfect until we get to heaven, it's important to still try to strive for living in the way that God tells us to live, and that lines up with the Bible. And so just making sure, like, we renew our minds, because although God created us to be a logistic being and think for ourselves and everything like that, it's important that we are renewing our minds, because how we think on earth is not the same way like God is. Our thoughts are different from God's thoughts in heaven, and he thinks more highly and different from us, and we have to try to get on the same page as God. I already did that slide. Hold on, guys. I think there was another verse. Let me just put this one up for the sake of it. So, yeah, the reason why I wanted to do this topic is because I overheard the conversation, and the conversation was basically just a different religion, and how, I did a little bit of research on it. I didn't go too much in depth, and that's something that you guys can research. Like, you can research cults and what they stand for. It's actually a lot, but just know that cults are obviously not of God. They're of the devil. And the other thing is that there's a distinguishing fact. It's different from just being in a relationship with God. It's different from committing to God and praying to God. It's so much different. You have to have your eyes open to realize. And I think when times like this happen, where people are forcefully, they're removed from their jobs and everyone is like unemployed at the same time, and we kind of get more into like the times of the Bible, where the Bible predicts and basically prophesies like these things are going to happen, and we start to see them little by little. Although we're not in like the end times, we're not in the times where it's the rapture and God's going to come back for the world. We're not quite there yet, but this is just like only the beginning of the beginning. And it's important to make sure that you yourself are paying attention to the signs, the warning signs, because there are warning signs in just like what goes on in the world. And it's important to know that like even you cannot just ignore these signs, right? You cannot ignore the signs for the simple fact that if you had a friend, or if you had a friend who was maybe like acting funny or giving you red flags, or if you had somebody who was giving you mixed signals, maybe that you like that person, or maybe you were already in a relationship with that person, or before you get into a relationship with that person, and that you start to see the signs, you start to see the red flags. That should be an indicator that that's something that you should slow down and really get the full picture on before you go into. And it's the same thing in this world. It's the same thing when we start to get the red flags and we start to see warning signs and things that are not quite right, but things that the Bible points out and says that's going to happen. It's important to take a step back and realize like, hey, this is God. Like, this is a sign of God coming. This is a sign of us getting closer to the end of times. This is a sign of where God is trying to speak to you and try to really get you to wake up and get your attention, and just for you to have knowledge and have truth. So in the conversation, one of the things that stood out to me was the person said that in their religion, after the person has already died and was buried and everything, they dig up their bones and then they baptize the bones. And so that way the person can enter into heaven, or spirit heaven. From my understanding, and if you read the Bible, you understand that there are 3 different heavens, they're not different, but it's one heaven, and then it's 3 different like parts of heaven. And I don't know what verse that is. You guys can look it up. But basically, the person who was saying all of this believes in spirit heaven. Now, I've never heard of spirit heaven before, and that's something that I still need to do more research on. And you guys can also look it up as well. Like, I would highly encourage you to look that up for yourself. But I thought it was a little bit strange, and the person was saying like once they baptize the bones and everything, it's still at the end of the day when that person whose bones was baptized and they get to heaven, they automatically will, I think she said, they automatically will get the opportunity to say yes or no to their own baptism. But it kind of wasn't making sense to me, for the simple fact that they believe that everyone will enter spirit heaven. And so it was just really weird, and kind of stood out to me. It made me take a step back and kind of realize that there are a lot of people who believe in certain things that they don't realize is a movement that has been started by somebody to really kind of get people off track, and to really kind of get people to go in the wrong way, in the wrong path, simply for the fact of being deceived, so that their souls can be lost forever. Because like I said, the Bible doesn't say that everyone will enter into heaven. I'm gonna bring that verse back up. There's no way that everyone who, says they are a believer or says they are following God will enter into heaven, because people say things that they don't really mean, and people do things that don't align with the way that God wants, or the way that God has designed and set for things to be done. And that is the scary part. That's the part that we need to really understand, and we really need to fully commit to understanding and commit to making it right with God. Because God has a certain standard. He has a certain design for how, when he first made the world, we can go back into the book of Genesis at the beginning, where God created everything. He had a certain standard. There was not supposed to be sin in the world. And a lot of the reasons why we have cults and everything is because sin was released into the world due to the mistake and the sin of Adam and Eve. And that's why we are now fighting to get back on the same page with God, because there was a disconnect. And now we have to go through all these things. We have to go through renewing our mindset so we can try to get back on the same page with God. Like, it's so easy for our sinful nature to consume us, our sinful thoughts, thinking like how the world thinks. But we have to try to cut that part off. The Bible talks about us not living in our flesh, but living in the spirit. When you are in the spirit, you are of God. You are allowing God to be on the inside of you, changing you, moving you, guiding and directing you, so you know that, hey, that your life aligns up and aligns with what God has said. Your life aligns with what God, the standard that God has set. And unfortunately, people don't know this because they either don't read the Bible, they don't have a full understanding of it. They don't know that they have God's Spirit, the Holy Spirit, on the inside of them, and they don't know how to use that power. But I'm telling you, it's as simple as just opening your mouth and having a conversation with God. It's as simple as asking God to really guide you and direct you in the right path. Like, you don't have to do anything special. There's no ritual that you have to go through. You don't have to jump through hoops. You don't have to baptize bones. There's nothing that you have to do for you to talk to God. There's nothing that you have to do for you to reach God. All you have to do is simply talk to him. Let him know that, you're there. That you want to understand him. That you want to know him. That you want to renew your mind. And you can begin to really walk in his way and submit to him. You can begin to really be changed and have his mind instead of a carnal mind. The Bible warns us about having a carnal mind, a worldly mind, a sinful mind, and just being and staying in our sinful nature. That cannot happen. And I promise you, if you go in the Bible and you read these verses, you can begin to understand that you don't have to do anything. There's no ritual that you have to commit to. It's not like a sorority where you have to do certain things to be, to enter into the sorority or to be accepted as part of as part of the standard that God has created. You don't have to do any of that. God already gave his son. All we have to do now is just accept the fact that Jesus was the lamb that was slain for all of us. And we have to know that, we basically just have to know that he has a standard for all of us, and that we should really be following the guidelines. But how do we follow the guidelines if we're not talking to him, if we're not asking for guidance? Because you can read the Bible all day long But if you don't have a full understanding of it, and if you don't try to really break it down and see like what God says about it, then you'll never understand it. You'll never renew your mind. You'll always have a carnal mind, and you won't live in the Spirit. But I'm telling you that in order for you to really follow in the way of God, you have to live in the Spirit. Like, you have to live in the Spirit so you don't miss Him, so that you don't end up like the people who say, Lord, Lord, and they do all these things. They cast out demons. They, whatever it is, and they perform miracles, but they're really doing it not in God's way. They're doing it for themselves. They're doing it because they're misinformed, and they don't know what it means to actually talk to God, just talk to God freely, and to really commit to Him and really have a relationship with Him.